Let's get started with the next session. It's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Ubbink for the next presentation. Dr. Ubbink is a PhD professor of food science and technology and department head of University of Minnesota. Dr. Ubbink is professor, and he was trained as a physical chemist at the University of Leiden, Netherlands, and he obtained his PhD in chemical engineering chemical engineering and material science at Delft University of Technology in Netherlands. He has worked over 15 years as R&D position in the food industry. Prior to joining the University of Minnesota, he was associated with California or Cal Poly San Luis Obispo. So that's our sister campus. So the University of Bristol, UK, and also ETH Zurich, Switzerland. So he has very vast experience in various industries and in academic setting. He was visiting scientist at Moscow State University, Russia, and he has taught as visiting professor in the School of Engineering, University of Campinas, Brazil. And his research interests include material science and processing of plant-based foods and societal impact of processed food and food culture. So again, accomplished professor and an administrator and with food industry experience. Please welcome Dr. Ubbink.
Thank you, Harmit, for your very nice introduction. And it's great to be back here at Cal Poly, the other Cal Poly. I must say, I spent 3 lovely years at Cal Poly SLO, already knowing a lot about, hearing a lot about, and meeting a lot of the colleagues from Cal Poly Pomona. So it's great to be here. I was here last year as well. And as it goes, Bilal invites you to speak, and then of course it's difficult to say no. I must say it's delightful to be here. And anyways, I had a little bit difficulty squeezing it in my my travel program this fall. But also, and I don't know if other speakers concur, but usually if you're speak at a conference, you propose a topic. If Bilal invites you to talk, actually he specifies the topic. So, which is good, which I like. So it's a bit of a, you have to, it's a bit of a challenge and then really try to address it, because actually Bilal also brings up these topics that are not so easily covered. But very important, very relevant. I love to talk about it, but actually complex topics. He asked me specifically to talk about the health impact, the nutritional impact of food processing for plant-based foods. Now that's a really big area. And I've actually been spending quite a bit of time trying to condense it into a storyline. So I hope you're with me here in the coming 15 minutes. So I restrained it already a little bit to not just to talk about all processed plant-based foods, but to limit it to extruded foods. And I have a number of reasons for that. One of the key reasons for that is that extrusion is considered by I would say, the larger community dealing with the health impact of ultra-processed foods as a basically no-go food processing technology. And I know that because I'm also part of a number of groups who are discussing a way forward out of a societal situation where we're actually food-wise, diet-wise, nutrition-wise not on a good side. And that whole conversation about ultra-processed foods, that's a word that, of course, you have seen it now often enough, but where ultra-processed foods are thought to be the culprit. Just one of those roles, there's a national panel that started a couple of months ago with about 25 researchers from various major universities in the US, and including one outside professor who's Carlos Monteiro from the University of Sao Paulo in Brazil, who actually came up 15 years ago with the concept of ultra-processed foods. And there are public health researchers, medical researchers, nutrition researchers. There's one food scientist from UC Davis serving on that panel, and one food technologist, and that should be me. So it's a very interesting setting to discuss. It's a very sincere conversation. But the thing which you then also realize is that how scientific evidence is weighted, what type of scientific evidence you take, that is very, very different between if you have a science and engineering background versus a background maybe in the medical science or a background in public health. I think these perspectives are all valid, but they're all partial puzzles of a very, very complex, pieces of a very, very complex puzzle. So that's actually the journey I want to take you on today, and have a conversation about that impact of processing on the nutritional quality of plant-based foods. Try to identify, is it really the processing is an issue, or are there maybe other things that at play? Already maybe sneak preview to the conclusion. I think there are multiple things at play, but it's definitely not only the processing, even if processing might be a contributing factor. So we'll be looking at plant-based processing of plant-based foods, then going into that categorization, and I will mainly align with the NOVA classification that Carlos Montero proposed now 15 years ago, but I think about everyone is now in this field is developing food classification schemes. I think about every week new ways of classifying food and processed foods are coming out. I will address then what a context we brought in is the relation between food processing and food formulation, and then see how that impacts it, or how also that is used by the industry in actually developing foods. And I think there's an important clue there. And then I will go more to the societal and cultural context of foods, because food is not just that physical product that we have. It's actually, food is something which is really integral to us, to our culture, to our behavior, to our relationships building, our resilience in our communities. And I think there are also important clues in how we market foods that are actually impacting that relationship with food that might then, and indirectly impact our health. And if I have time, I'm not sure I will get to there. There are a lot of policies, taxes, proposed, regulations which are being proposed. If I have a few minutes, I might review for that. Just someone sent me an email that actually is just a tweet out. I'm not on Twitter or X as it's called today. I think there's at the federal level now, and again, an initiative coming. At least Twitter tells us, or X tells us, for what it's worth. Again, trying to ban the sales of ultra-processed foods. So I think it's really important that we address this topic well, because we know how essential food processing is. We also have to acknowledge that something needs to happen in our food system. So what is processing? I always go back to the definition from the IFT, the Institute of Food Technologists. I think, if someone should know it, they're them. And that's basically and I won't read it all, but it basically centered around transformation of agricultural products into processed foods. So the thing is, which is really essential there, is that word transform. You transform something from that agricultural produce into a food. And as we know, there are very few raw foods that we just eat happily. Fruits and vegetables probably amongst the only ones which you can eat in close to native state. Even something like cereals, we have to process intensely before we can actually eat and digest them. Why do we do processing? A whole range of reasons. It has to range from shelf life, food safety, convenience, appeal, taste, texture, etc., etc. These are all directly product related, and let's call them short-term impacts. But also we're increasingly concerned with the long-term impact of the food that we're consuming. Dr. Shah already called out the environmental impact, which is a really important reason to shift more to plant-based diets. If you eat whatever steak today, environment will survive. If we continue to do it for decades, it's going to have a major negative impact. But also long-term impact is if we don't have sufficient nutrient-dense foods and all kinds of micronutrients. Short-term, we're okay. Long-term, we're going to suffer. And also what we see is that we need to avoid these chronic, diet-related chronic diseases. And these are, I just heard the prevalence here, I think 40% of Americans is pre-diabetic or diabetic. These are really, really very, very worrying numbers. So food shouldn't set us up for actually these chronic diseases. Many of our foods and in the way they're incorporated in our lifestyle actually do. So that's something, and dietitians here will definitely align with that. That's something which is really, really worrisome. And then we have, of course, low energy. We want to have low energy density foods to avoid that obesity pandemic that we're suffering from. So these are just some general reasons. And now let's have a look at some of the key questions. So why is a society and the current in the news and in the scientific fields, why are we so much dealing with that topic of nutritional consequences of food processing. Why is that so much in the headlines? Now, of course, because of the societal impact. But if we pose ourselves the question, there's always immediately that we should ask ourselves, what do we mean by this? What are these nutritional consequences of food processing? How do we define them? What are those? So I will at least try to give some of my perspectives on that, and there are multiple dimensions to that. I don't pretend to have a complete answer to it. And then very importantly also, it's how do we assess these nutritional consequences? How do we weigh the various pieces of information that we can gather? How do we weigh them in our understanding of the impact of these foods that are part of a diet, that are part of a lifestyle, that are part of a culture and a food system, on the long-term impact of the health of individuals who are members of our communities, of our society in this country and in the world. So it's a very difficult thing, and I think also there it is where we see that there is a really difference in perspectives. I mentioned a part of the panel, which is mainly the main members are in public health, in the medical sciences, nutritional sciences, policymakers. They're really worried about it, sincerely worried about that, and they're really trying to zoom in on defining the food ingredients that we should out-regulate to make our food system healthy. I don't think we'll fully get there. I don't think that's really feasible. I just came back from a conference in Chile where we had a lot of food scientists and food engineers present, including those who are from the engineering side involved in the development of what they call rational food processing classification schemes. And they're also very worried. They agree there's something not quite right with the food that's available. But they're very upset with this first group, and this first group is very upset with that second group. So we're circling around a big theme, and I from both sides I see a sincere concern, but I don't think that we know yet how to bridge that gap and work together to achieve a more healthy foods. Because with both groups, I see there's the intent, but how do we bring it together? So we need to define, or at least understand that we maybe cannot define all aspects of that and find agreement, at least some subcategories. And then we also need to agree on how we assess what type of data, scientific data. So plant-based foods, now if we process them, let's start really with the process. That's what the law asked me to do, so let's go there. Just listing some of the most common operations, food process operations, as we apply them to foods, plant-based foods. From just simple things like washing, sanitizing, cutting, grating, etc., etc. But by the way, if you see it in operation, for instance, here in California, in the fruit and vegetable processing industry, you're amazed the level of processing engineering that's behind them and how efficient and how safe and how economically they can do that. Towards things about cereals, threshing, dehusking, milling, etc. And then we go down, and what we'll see that at some moment we go to the operations where we have, let's say, more significant impact on our ingredients. We really start transforming these ingredients into foods which have different shapes, textures, bioavailability of the nutrients, etc., etc. Yeah? So let's try to, and I'm not pretending here to bring a new classification system in. Let's see a little bit, let's group this a little bit into the type of impact that process has on these ingredients. From in here in green, and with green I don't mean that's necessarily the good thing. I think overall it's probably a good thing, but processes that maintain tissue integrity, so where we have the whole fruits, the whole vegetable, the whole meat or whatever seafood type of matrix. Mechanical disruption, where we, for instance, mill it or grind it or break it. To separation and recombination. Then we have here chemical changes, chemical modifications. And then we go having thermal impact. We heat it up to cook it, we heat it up to evaporate things, but we have that thermal impact. And then we can combine that with shear, and then we have thermomechanical food processing operations. And that's, of course, where, and that is not a word that my fellow members on that U of P panel are using, but that's actually, of course, extrusion is a thermomechanical process and could have dire impact, that at least their implicit hypothesis on the nutritional quality of foods, and that's one of the things I want to investigate with you. So now actually I have taken this operation and then color-coded them. It's not perfect, but just let's first pass through, let's color-code them as to the impact of the process on that food or that ingredient. And then you can take a next step, and of course you see the more fresher your food, the less impactful it is. You keep really your product intact, and here you have a full transformation of your ingredient. And I'm not saying that is necessarily a bad thing, but I just say this is something that happens. Now, if you take these operations, you can also group them a little bit differently and say, you know, where do I apply these, in the main, these specific operations? So intact whole foods, think about these fruits, veggies, whole meats, etc. These are usually in that green where we keep that product matrix intact. We maybe cool it or freeze it for increased shelf life. Then we have prepared meals and food items, and then we have things like canning, freezing, drying, smoking, salting, and we know actually that salting foods, to preserve foods is not necessarily something which is healthy for you. Smoking, we know by now, is actually leading to carcinogens accumulating in the food matrix with a long-term health impact, so it's definitely not specifically good, but these are still part of our conventional set of ways we prepare meals and food items. Then of course cooking, evaporating, that's then the thermal component. And there we transition to what we call the developed foods, the foods from product development. And there I will call them out later as ultra-processed foods. These techniques we actually can either apply for regular food processing, or we can apply them into these ultra-processed foods type of setting. And there we have also some specific processes that we use primarily for these classes of developed food products, from product development foods, and that are foods that are very often categorized as ultra-processed. Now we have more operations that we use in food processing, and these apply to the ingredients, like transforming or producing the ingredients for cooking and baking, like the oils and the flours and the sugar and so on. That's over here. But then we have a separate category, which I think is important to realize, ingredients for product development, where we isolate, fractionate into chemical synthesis, chemical modifications, and physical modifications. These are all these components, all these ingredients and additives that food developers can use in formulating an actual food, mainly in that category of developed foods. Good, so we see here we have these different classes. Now going through it in this way actually aligns surprisingly well with that classification that Carlos Montero proposed 15 years ago, that NOVA system, with the category of unprocessed or minimally processed foods, fresh foods, and the things which are made by easy operation, like grinding or pressing or freezing of these products. Then group 2 are these processed culinary ingredients, which are not necessarily healthy for you. No one will say, eat a lot of butter or use as much oil or sugar as you want. But these are used actually in the preparation of meals that you make typically at home. Then we have processed foods, which are the classical foods as we know them, like that, whatever, there can be sourdough bread to canned peas. Which are traditionally seen as part of a regular common diet. And then the class of foods that he really called out, he really singled out, and I think it's marketing genius, he said these are ultra-processed foods. That are all these things that are these branded foods based on ingredients which are combined in these various type of things, very often based on very complex formulations of ingredients, industrially produced with a number of aspect to them which singles them out. And I'm saying aspects, not per se processing aspects, and not per se nutritional aspects, but there are some qualities in these foods that I want to discuss with you that set them actually apart from most of these other groups. If we want to start talking also about the nutritional impact, and I will show you results from several recent studies, I think it's always good to go back to a baseline understanding what's a healthy diet. And to me, basically the scientific evidence is, the current scientific evidence is really condensed there in what our dietitians are working with their patients, with their clients. And then I think it makes sense to look at the dietary guidelines for Americans 2025. We're now in 2025, so I think we're all waiting for the 25-30 dietary guidelines to come out. And I think that's that tweet that my colleague Al Levine just mailed to me was probably about this. So let's see where that is going. Stay tuned there. But this is the one which is still active as of now. And what you will see, it says make half your plate fruits and vegetables. So that means actually the fresh fruit, the fresh products. And the other category, what I really want to single out, make half your grains whole grains. So I think if we just add up this type of thing, it already hints into, as I would say, established scientific evidence that we should mostly eat fresh fruit, fresh foods, and definitely cereals are a really important component of our diet. They should be ideally whole grain. So also some kind of significantly processed, but without losing all these nutritional benefits from whole grain, the whole grain. So I think this should be, and I think also for those, and I'm now thinking about my colleagues we have met in Chile, and the food engineers and the food scientists, I think we should realize that an approach where we say, oh yes, we can make very healthy, very highly processed foods, I don't think it aligns with the current, I would say, agreed scientific evidence as it is condensed in the dietetic guidelines, that let's say at least three quarters what is on our plate should be in the less processed category. Yeah, so that we use food processing is really clear, that we even use it in complex settings and really have advanced food processing is clear. But I think we should also agree that the current standards of evidence point that we should eat a lot of these less processed type of foods. I think that should be just a common understanding. And the vary your protein routine, I will talk here a little bit about some of this plant protein work. And we had also a previous speaker spoke about the technology and the industry and the development of those. And see, can that factor in as a healthy protein source? And of course, these are recommendations. And are we there in the United States? No, for sure not. This, I think, is also from the dietary guidelines, I think very illustrative. Total vegetables, and then a number of categories here. If you're around 0, you're at the recommended intake. If you're below it, you're below recommendation. So whatever we do, we need to make sure that we transition to eating more of those foods. Independent if ultra-processed foods are bad or less bad, or we can make them more healthy for you. I think this is, this is nothing new. Should be really clear. The same as with fruits. Whole grains are really the worst here. I think if I look at this, 5% of Americans probably eat enough whole grains as part of their diet. So this should be just accepted that, hey, how can we, I think a main drive see how can we budge this? And then we see these other foods here, for instance, the refined grains, conversely, is really, we're way too high in the consumption of refined grains. And as we'll see, these refined grains, plus a number of other food ingredients are used in these ultra-processed foods. This is a recent overview, or from a recent article, an overview in the past 20 years, the fraction of calories in our diet for males and females that are constituted of ultra-processed foods, and we're close to 60% here in the United States, which is #1 worldwide. So, and in the current system, a lot of those ultra-processed foods indeed consist of products that are really high in refined flours, maybe saturated fats, and maybe a lot of sugar in these type of things. And then we're minimally processed food, which should be that 3/4 of our plate. You see we're hovering here around a 30% with a slight decrease downward over those 20 years. So we're definitely not where we are, but this is now the main category of foods that we're eating here in the United States. So I talked about health impact, and it says that baseline is that understanding as we actually, the shared understanding of scientific impact as we put it in, for instance, the dietetic guidelines. So of course you can go to the outcome of nutritional studies. One of the main type of studies it conducts are these so-called large cohort studies. And Haynes, for instance, where they follow groups, in this case of nurses, they have also for health professionals, and other countries are conducting it, looking at health status, mortality of tens of thousands of individuals, or here there's a smaller study up to about 1,100 here. And then look at the, how over the decades these nutritional status and the health status and maybe mortality evolves, depending also on the food intake. And if you look at the category with the post hoc, they said this is ultra-processed foods. These studies were very often started before the whole concept of ultra-processed food was proposed in 2010. If you regroup them and they say, okay, we have ultra-processed foods, and then start to look at correlations with these adverse health effects from overweight, obesity here to metabolic syndrome, you see that from these cohort studies, so statistically, you see that overall that shift to the side where you don't want to be, to the increased risk side. Yeah? So this is of course something which comes out of the studies, and that's within the context that it's being a cohort study with statistical analysis, it's a valid observation. The thing is, it doesn't tell you which food. So I will show some results later where we look more into details in what type of food category is in it, and then we see if we can branch it to, let's say, our science and engineers would want to go ahead and establishing the health impact of what they can do in processing of foods. So these are these very general outcomes of what we categorize ultra-processed foods on these indicators of health as they relate to diet. And there it typically shifts, and this is not the only study, there are many out by them. I think every week there are new ones published. They typically, not exclusively, but typically shifted to the level of increased risk. Of course, you can say, oh yeah, this is evidence, ultra-processed foods are really bad for you, so we should really get them out of our food system. And that's what I also hear when I'm talking with my colleagues. That's also when they talk about that impact of processing. Processing is, and I find that sometimes, even a little bit hurtful, being very involved in processing, is it something which is necessarily a bad thing? And sure, if you eat an apple or if you eat your broccoli, there's a lot of processing needs to happen. Even there, as I said, I'm very impressed how the industry, especially here now in California and Central Valley, with all these fruits and vegetables and tree nuts that you grow, I must say that processing at a very advanced level, even though it's minimally invasive, a minimal physical impact on your product. But for many foods, we actually need that processing to make them whatever digestible, appealing, stable, and also safe. So I think I want to explore that. So a thing we proposed early the year, we were invited for an article, Annual Review Food Science and Technology, is can we actually analyze food processing in a bit of a standardized method, like let's say in chemical engineering, my PhD was in that field, as Dr. Singh called out, using some of these, basic operations, let's say unit operations, and then color code them eventually with that in that NOVA system, with from green to red, with the impact if they're minimally processed, or if they processed, or if they're ultra processed. And yes, you can do that. So we propose here some of these simple symbols, which will be then regular between your operations, and then you can start looking at the processing of various types of foods. And I'll focus here, of course, on plant-based foods. First thing is, I mentioned the broccoli and the apples. They are even, whatever, they're desanitized or washed, they're packaged sometimes on a protective atmosphere. But then we go into, let's say, take something which you process a little bit more in the plants that are something like peas, a vegetable which you typically don't sell fresh unless in farmers markets in the season for a few weeks. So we either can them, that's an older technology, or we freeze them. Even here we see that actually these processes, they're pretty complex. Many steps involved in making something like frozen peas or canned peas. Yeah? According to NOVA, canned peas are processed foods. Why? They're heated up. That's not the main reason. Actually, they contain salt. So if you would make canned peas without salt, they probably could be minimally processed, but basically they all contain salt. Frozen peas is a way more advanced technology, and even with flash freezing, that's really advanced food technology. That's considered minimally processed. It's still pretty impactful. We need to make sure we preserve the quality. We need to make sure that we achieve energy efficiencies in this process. Very expensive operation otherwise. But it's so from the public health perspective, it's called minimally processed. But as food technologists, we know we do a lot of processing to get these actually in that state. After production, during the whole transport and retail to the consumer at home. I'm going to look at the quality of these things. What are the benefits, canning versus freezing? Don't want to call it out, but I think here the advanced technology is freezing. One of the things that it actually does, it leads to better nutrient retention, significantly better than during canning, and actually even properly frozen peas are better than fresh peas after a week of sitting in the drawer in your refrigerator. So technology here actually really works to improve nutritional quality. You can say, how do you know that? Yeah, you can back that up. And I think that's one thing I want to call out. This is actually vitamin C retention after canning and blanching and freezing. The thing what I want to call out is that, first of all, freezing technology, this is a more recent reference, has led to way lower degradation of vitamin C than the more historical technologies, but also show you how old a lot of these data is. There's actually very little data on that with modern processes, how they impact the nutritional quality, where we could really see that actually it helps to get better, nutritionally better foods, into your pantry, into your fridge, or into your freezer. So that's the part of plant-based foods. That's, let's say, just my one example for that, what should be 3/4 of your plate, or at least half of that plate of fruit and vegetables. So let's now turn to cereals, and then we'll turn to plant proteins, and then I'll look at extrusion technology. So if we extrude cereals, think about snacks, and we'll talk mainly about breakfast cereals, then we have the ingredients, can be corn kernels, wheat berries. We have to process them into a flour that we can use to extrude. Yeah. And so again, and that's also what I'm calling out to my friends in public health or in the medical field, that says that bag of flour that is sitting in your kitchen pantry is actually a lot of processing behind it. That's if you go to an actual flour mill, you'll see how advanced the technology is. And depending on how you do it, you can actually get rid of a lot of the fibers, or you can keep them in. It's basically not depending on the process. It's depending on the choice of the operator. Says, oh, today we make refined flour, tomorrow we make whole grain flour. They can just switch it and then up they go. Yeah, just to understand the complexity and the way that's been evolving as a very integrated process, highly efficient process over the years. Cornmeal is actually very much more simple. But just to call out, we really need to process those before we can do something else with it. And these ingredients, we can make cornbread, we can make at home our pancakes, but we of course can also then use them, for instance, in extrusion. So let's have a look at that. So if we make bread, then we can make industrial bread. So if we make artisanal bread, typically the only thing we add is salt. Still, it's considered as a processed food, but still healthy in Nova. As soon as we transition to industrial bread, you see we add a lot of components to it to formulate it, to, for instance, improve shelf life, and some other, maybe flavor of the bread in some sense. And this is considered ultra-processed. I will come to these ingredients later on and have some words about that. And then we're going to make our breakfast cereals. We can do it very traditionally, like Dr. Kellogg formulated his cornflakes 150 years ago. Just cooking them, flaking them, toasting them, and then we have plain cornflakes, and these are seen as typically processed foods. Now, if we run it through an extruder, they're automatically considered to be ultra-processed, even though that's just that thermomechanical operation. We're going to look at the impact of extrusion on the nutritional quality. Of course, what we do in industry, we start adding a lot of other things to it, specifically sugar. Last week I was teaching my my advanced food material science course, a graduate course in Minnesota, I asked my students to talk a bit about breakfast cereals, and they brought in one bag. We had a look at the label, 35% by weight of sugar, which is a lot of sugar in these things. Yeah? So, yes?
Sorry, can I ask the group 3 and group 4? So, artisan bread, industrial bread, when we bought on the shelf, like 85C, like Paris baguette, are they industrial bread or they claim to be artisan bread?
If you typically buy it from a supermarket, most of it will be group 4 ultra-processed. But I would look at the label. If it says emulsifiers or dough conditioners, in Nova it's considered ultra-processed.
But artisan becomes like an adjective for a lot of bakery.
Yes.
Artisanal. That means they are not artisanal.
No, they're not artisanal. Yes. So let's have a look at that extrusion process, and because also that extrusion is really singled out in the public health field as something which is, a very detrimental technique. So extrusion was just presented by the previous extruder. We feed this flour into the barrel, we heat it up, we shear it, and then we expand it into these breakfast cereals. This is working in this type of extrusion cooking. Very quick operation, stays in the barrel maybe for a minute or two. From the cereal we go, and I go further here. So into that expanded breakfast cereal, so we can make that with a pure whole grain or refined flour. And then the question is, of course, what does that process do in the nutritional quality? Now we can look at it from 3 angles. We can look at nutrients, change the nutrient content. We can look at it from the process side, if we apply the shear, if we apply the temperatures, if we transform that structure of the ingredients. And we can look at the clinical parameters. So nutrient absorption rates, diversity of the microbiome, gut comfort, stool quality, whatever. Yeah? What have we investigated? We know a little bit about this, actually know quite a bit about this. We have very little data on this, and we have no data on the process space. Very little or almost non-existent that we have information, quantitative information on the impact of the extrusion process on what actually happens with the nutritional product quality of that product. So I think that's really a dearth of information we have. This is an example of just that on the first part, let's say the nutrient content of starch, protein, and lipid. Now we see that, and this is for oats, going down a little bit. It's a very recent publication, going down a little bit with increase, if we go from raw material to dry heating to through extrusion, but pretty mild. And if you look then at the starch hydrolysis in a in vitro digestion assay, we see that compared to another breakfast food, could be white bread, that actually these oats, even extruded, that have a very slow digestion. So they typically would expect it to be better for moderating glycemic spikes. Do we have clinical data on that? Actually, there's almost nothing around it. Do we have a systematic variation with how we extrude it? No, that doesn't exist. Actually, I just submitted a grant with 2 of my clinical colleagues last week to one that was invited for that by one of these research foundations. So we hope to look into that. But there's basically very little actual evidence of that. So one thing we propose, let's say, really look here at these quantitative parameters, and those who know extrusion will know specific mechanical energy, that we control that during these processes to have a look there at the impact on the nutritional quality. So this brings me to how public health researchers versus scientists, let's say the more food scientists would weigh evidence. Public health perspectives is, you take 100 boxes of breakfast cereals from the grocery store, you look at their composition and say, oh, these are not good for you. Statistically, they're right. 90% is not healthy for you. Try to find it out yourself. The question is that then from the engineering side, is it related to how we extrude it? There, I'm really not convinced. And even some of these large cohort studies appear to show that actually it is maybe not fully the case. Again, you group a lot of things together. This was published in The Lancet 2 years ago. I think what we see very often in these studies, we see that animal-based foods are definitely not good for your health. And that was what Dr. Singh also called out in the early part of the day. And artificially and sugar-sweetened beverages are also not really good for you. And I think these animal-based foods can also be these processed foods. Let's say cured meats, salted meats, smoked meats, and these type of things, sausage-based type of things. Pretty solid evidence by now. Yeah. Interestingly, ultra-processed breads and cereals, they tend to be lowering that risk a little bit, even from these cohort studies. Yeah? So we group them. It's still a broad group, and I don't know if all the cereals are extruded or not. There might be classical cornflakes. But we know a lot of these cereals are actually really high in sugar. And even then, actually, it's not say that you should unlimited eat them, but they're absolutely less detrimental than these whatever sugar-sweetened beverages and processed meats. Yeah? And interestingly, also the plant-based alternatives, and if I have time, we'll spend still a few minutes on that, they tend to be a little bit on that other side. So from what we know at this stage, so there's very little data on the actual impact of the process on the nutritional quality. Some of that are pretty sparse, as I mentioned, some of them historical data. So I think there's an absolute need to really start looking at the process. But from the evidence as I see it, I don't see really hard evidence that is in this case the process. I'm not saying these breakfast cereals are good for you. They're way too high in sugar. But I don't think at this stage that really it's the extrusion that's making the product really bad for you, at least not in a direct sense. Is this working? Oh yeah. So let's take a few minutes to talk about the plant-based meats. So we have low moisture extruded and then the high moisture extruded. Previous speaker highlighted you get these very nice fibers. So I think I can skip that part. Now if we start processing them, we don't start from a milled whole cereal or a refined cereal. We start already with industrially produced ingredients that are include a lot of fractionation, separation, sometimes modification steps. They're just the processing here of soy. The thing what we use in these meat analogs is either soy protein isolate or concentrate. Isolate is a bit higher in protein content, otherwise it's the same thing. They go through a whole series of processing steps. Question is, do we need it? Do we want that? We've seen the health impact is probably okay-ish, but just realize there's a whole industry behind it, and many steps to actually get that starting material to actually then produce, in the end, these texturized vegetable proteins, which, because they're extruded, considered ultra-processed. But again, we don't have data to say, it's extrusion which would make them not healthy. There's just no data at all around that. And then we take that and then we formulate it with a whole series of components into, for instance, a hamburger patty or a nugget or whatever you want to make with it. Yeah? And there are a lot of points where I would say, before we can really make that assessment about the impact of the process, we have to decouple it from that formulation, and we have to make sure that we have data that actually can support the impact of these individual steps next to these larger scale cohort studies. So you formulate them then. These are my students at Cal Poly from fond memories from 7-8 years ago. And then what you see, these products are really, really complex formulations. Compared to a breakfast cereal, actually they contain also a lot of stuff if you add vitamins or whatever to them. But these are really complex formulations. Is that bad for us or not? That's an open question. It's not necessarily bad. I just want to call it out. The evidence as it stands, and this is based on the nutrient profiling of a whole series of foods, including vegan meat alternatives, non-vegan meat alternatives, poultry meat, and red meat. And what we see is a pretty recent publication, actually, that compared to meats, when properly formulated, they have been gone down quite a bit in salt in recent years, is that these meat alternatives actually could fit your at least based on nutrient content, the requirement is better than most meat products, with the exception of a few categories. So yes, we can actually, even with all that industry step, we can make a product which, at least from the nutrient composition, should fit reasonably well with your diet. if it really works out, we don't know, because there's no clinical studies at this moment. We don't know really how it long-term works out, or even short-term work out on your health status. So I think really research needs to be done. And then I think a few slides from my side to wrap up. I think, how many minutes do I have? I think 5 minutes or so, probably. 3 minutes, so let's wrap it up in the next 3 minutes then. As I said, I can continue for this is such a broad topic, so that, thank you, Bilal, for proposing it to me. But actually, I want to maybe add one component to here, which I think is also very, very important, is as scientists, we tend to focus really on the actual foods. Yeah? The staples, your complementary items, could be, for instance, a protein and a starch thing. It could be your flavor principles to make it into something which you like to eat, which is part also of a cultural pattern. Then you have your peripheral foods. So think about the snacks and the incidentals, and the turkey for Thanksgiving was already mentioned. But these are actual foods. We tend to focus a lot on that, especially as food scientists and engineers. But there's one thing which I think is also really important, how that food and in the form that it's offered and the way it is sold actually impacts your behavior, your cultural, your food ways. And I think that's something where there might be a clue why that whole ultra-processed foods is a very useful concept, even though it doesn't really relate to processing, in my opinion. So these foods are elements of a diet that's embedded in cultural food ways. And the way we actually market these foods, and this is what we published in that annual reviews paper. The thing what you see about these foods is here above that typical iceberg analogy. The thing the price alike and the convenience and so on, this is what we see directly as consumers and individuals. This is all hidden below the waterline, as to say, how these foods, especially these marketed branded foods, start impacting our food traditions, our food ways, our meal patterns, our cooking skills, and then the cooking skills, family and social relationships, etc. So I think that's the thing. And then coming back to that initial classification from ingredients to prepared meals to these developed foods, I think it's maybe not directly the health impact of these foods, even though many of them are maybe not very, very good for you if you eat them in bulk, but it's the way actually all these factors are influenced by our food system that we should have a closer look at. And this actually is my limited attempt at ChatGPTing. I was thinking about, a French croissant. These are not good for you. These are not ultra-processed. The refined flours, ton of butter. I put even more butter on them. Friends of mine said, whoa, do you sure need over more butter on my croissant? Salt in them. So are these good? No, they're not good for you. But how do you eat them? You typically eat them as, let's say Sunday breakfast. Everybody gets one small croissant. You take time with your family or with your friends to have a conversation, so you eat slowly. And it's part of a cultural tradition. And these potato chips, and thanks ChatGPT, I think you did it pretty well there. These potato chips might intrinsically be less detrimental for your health, weight by weight, than that croissant, but how do you eat them? You're not going to sit with your family on Sunday around the table, even portioning out, you're binging it over Netflix, a whole XXL bell, and you're not going to stop halfway. So there's more to do with the format of your food and how we market that than with actually nutritional content. Both are not good for you. But here we know how to regulate it in cultural patterns. And here we're set up actually to continuously overeat. So I think, I love the word ultra-processing, probably the only food technologists who looked at word. There was a lot of bad feelings about that when I was in Chile, and I see also that in my LinkedIn channel often popping up. I think it really points out something important. I don't think it's per se the process that it should be calling out. I don't think that it's maybe more even, and that's what Al Levine published in these 2 articles, is more the formulation. And why are we formulating foods? We are formulating foods because people buy them in formats that as industry we can easily satisfy. And the previous speaker called it out, we need to make a profit. Sure, I get it. I worked for years at many companies, and sure, we need to stay in business. So it might be more related to that ultra-processing, that's actually the way we market these foods, rather than the process impact. Are we going to get away with that word ultra-processed foods? No, I don't think so. I think my colleagues, I can tell them, no, it's not going to happen. Al and me tried to introduce the word ultra-formulated, but I think it's already more appropriate, but we're not going to make it with that. And it could even be a more general thing, is actually how we're setting us up in our food system for people to entice them to buy foods and then to continue to eat foods, even though that, it brings them way out of their healthy diet. And I think that's probably a good space to wrap up. Maybe just as a very last slide, I see very gradually some research coming in on this impact of these, let's say, these formulated foods or these developed foods on our food traditions. I think we also need research there. So I think we need research really on the relation between food processing and nutrient content and clinical results. And these studies are not easy to pull off, but really needed. But we also really need much more of the social sciences. We're looking at how the availability or the purchasing decisions that consumers make to buy foods impact the quality of diet. And here, this is an interesting one, is actually the cooking frequency in a family, from almost no cooking to cooking all the time. And then you still actually group 4 ultra-processed foods. It goes down a little bit, but even those who are cooking are actually still buying a lot of that ultra-processed foods. But I think we need to have more data underlying our behavior, collective behavior in a society for various foods and for various individuals and communities to really better understand where it derails. So a lot of the efforts that are currently in place to try to outlaw or outregulate maybe extrusion or certain ingredients, I don't think it's going to change it. But I think we need to change it, but we need way more understanding before we can take the decision. And I think this is a good time to call it the end of my presentation. So I'd like to open it for questions.
Yeah, thank you so much. Thank you, Dr. Ubbink. I'm so glad you showed the mountain of ice, reminding me of my 2 years in your lab shoveling snow in Minnesota. Thank you so much. I have no regrets moving to California. So the floor is open for questions.
Thank you for your work on the government panel and your commitment to correcting the misunderstandings around what actually makes food healthy and unhealthy. I'm concerned that, for example, the panel is starting from the FDA's definition of what is healthy plate, which we know is extremely influenced by meat and dairy industry lobbying, and back from the time of the McGovern report. I'm concerned that we are in a propaganda war by an industry that makes profit through killing. It's the food military industrial complex, versus a group of loving, vegetarian, environmentally conscious, gentle, kind people. And we're in a propaganda campaign, not a scientific and education campaign, against a very aggressive, very propaganda influencing, a powerful lobby. And so my question or suggestion is somehow we have to come up with a way, as scientists and academics, to reframe the terms of research, to not accept that meat and dairy products are unprocessed natural outcomes. There's an extreme, I heard a wonderful presentation by Dr. Hassan about the process steps before you get hamburger in a styrofoam container in the supermarket. And the number of steps from raw inputs from seeds in the soil through the extremely unsanitary biological processes of a cow or a chicken or a dairy farm, extreme unsanitary processes leading to extremely unsanitary E. coli, including hamburger processing meat plants, and no ingredient information about the disease-causing agents in meat, no education or propaganda about the importance of fiber as a prebiotic for probiotics versus saturated fats and rotten meats as a prebiotic for malbiotics, and a focus only on cancer as a disease concern in ingredients, in formulations, and not any concern about, not any discussion or public awareness of the other diseases, the other chronic diseases that are induced by the saturated fats and the animal proteins. And so it's a huge war and has been going on for decades. Mm-hmm. But my challenge to you in the academic community would be, we need some leaders who reframe the whole structure of the research framework and don't accept the terminologies and the scope of research and the definitions of terms that lead us to UPFs are bad, meat is natural, and to go back and focus on the chronic disease impacts and the diseases other than cancer. And even things as simple as you could call an extruder a pressure cooker, and it's the only thing in your process that looks like an unfamiliar name to a consumer. Extruder, what's that? But if you call it a pressure cooker, then everything in your plant processing sounds like something you do at home in the kitchen. And if instead of calling it pea protein extract isolate, you call it peas as the ingredient, there are things that could be done with the labeling in the industry to help move the needle in the propaganda war. You're in the middle of it, and I'm curious to make turn it into a question, what hope is there for leadership in the propaganda war? And I'm assuming that this community would like to see the country move to a more plant-centric diet, but what's happening and what hopes are there for reframing the conversation and beginning to compete head-to-head in the propaganda war?
Yes, thank you. That's
Don't forget, great question.
Yes. Yes, I agree with a lot what you say. I also want to nuance a part. I think these studies have not only focused on cancer. There are a lot of studies on cancer, but there are also a lot of other types of.
The ingredients that people worry about when they can't read things in the label.
True. True, and I agree, but I must say there's a lot of information about a lot of these other nutritional outcomes. There's also about morbidity and then, of food consumption for these large cohort studies, depending on how your diet is skewed and then related to actually multiple factors. So I think there is, especially from these larger cohort studies, there is data available. That in the public, the Center on Cancer, I don't know as a scientist how to address it apart from bringing up the central premises. The My Plate, I think it's overall. I think there's a lot of value in it. You mentioned dairy there. Yes, that's. I think that suddenly popped up when they were defining it. There's suddenly dairy in that. Now I'm myself not against dairy, but I realize there is I don't think it's fully backed up by. You can have extremely healthy diets without any dairy in it. That works really well. So that's at least a cultural determinant, and sure there is an industry effort behind that as well. But I think what I see from my side, and I know the industry well. I know some of these factors that play. I wouldn't even now comment about where we are in a larger society, how things are being plugged. Let's see how that evolves. That could be more short-term, could be long-term impact. But what I know is at least between, one thing I really realized being now a couple of years part of, on one hand, the community of those food scientists and engineers versus the public health researchers, medical researchers, nutrition researchers, I think there could be much more of an understanding between them and an acceptance of what type of hard data or statistical data can be collected and how we can collectively interpret, because at this stage that's just not possible. And I just give one example there. I have since a couple of weeks an email in my inbox. I don't know how to respond to it. That's about minerals, as indicators for food being ultra processed. where they want to zoom in and out, and then say, oh yeah, but you're sure if we have whatever, and there's a source of potassium, and suddenly there are 20 compounds which have potassium, which do all kinds of other things in your food. And I must say, I think from the perspective of public health research to bring up these compounds, as a food engineer, can do very little with them. So I think this is the first thing that we need to cement, that we need to be able to work together between the engineering folks and the medical and the public health researchers. That's actually what I want to illustrate a bit in my talk here, outlining that we have different types of scientific evidence, and we're very little cognizant between the disciplines of how that weighs in.
Thank you. We can take one more question. We stand between you and the lunch. So one more question, please. And Dr. Ubbink, in 2 minutes.
My question is about frying. So fried products are consumed a lot. So for example, healthy grains or cereals that are rich in protein, when they're fried, have they been studied as to how the protein degrades or deteriorates in the fried food? So that is my question about processing.
Okay. To be fully open, I haven't looked in all the results about frying. And sure, that is on the one hand an extreme process, I would say, at the surface of your product. One thing I always keep in mind, knowing my heat and mass transfer and my food physics, is let's say if you fry food, the interior is still below cooking temperature or close to cooking temperature, so the bulk might not be even too much impacted with that, but things can certainly happen at the surface or on the surface layer. And one thing for sure we know in frying, that depending on your product, you can get all kinds of adverse components generated, acrylamide, for instance. But it's not only in frying that we generate it. We also fry that, in baking, for instance, we can generate it. So I think we would need to look in a case-by-case situation. The thing is, just looping it back to those conversations of extrusion, one reason is that it brought up that extrusion is so bad because it generates all these terrible compounds. I think there's some data on that, but basically anything we heat up, you're generating these compounds. So frying could be worse. I'm not 100% sure. Frying certainly with the fat content is not where you want to be. So you're eating too much fat if you fry your food. I think that's still the principal factor, but sure, we generate unhealthy compounds and we might degrade proteins.
We will allow a 30-second question because we have a high schooler joining us with her mother. Sure. So please go ahead, 30 seconds.
I was just wondering, what do you think are like the health impacts of like sugar alcohols? And like, do you think sugar alcohols are worse than sugar? Because I feel like there's not enough like research in it. I'm just wondering your opinion. Yeah,
I'm not an expert on sugar alcohols. I know, quite a number of them actually we don't digest them, and they play havoc down here. So it's something why I personally don't eat too much of them. I don't think we have the clinical evidence that they're harmful. Usually these things, actually was a slide which I didn't present here. It's on evidence, the general recognized as safe. So it might be very mild effects, but the question is, would we really need to use in our food? But I think we need more research to be conclusive. One thing to call out, many of the sugar alcohols also occur in fruits, but then they're intact in the fruit. And that might make a difference. I think, eating them as part of an integral food item is typically much more, I would say, forgiving in the body than just having a concentrated dose of a large amount of some of the sugar alcohols.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Ubbink. He is not going anywhere. Big round for Dr. Ubbink. We will be here for the coming 2 days. He's here today for the dinner, so please continue those conversations with him. Just a few reminders. You have a QR code on your tables. Please scan them. Is evaluations for the speakers. And don't forget the internship board. Our students already start to write their names, contacts, or freeze for those companies who have some internships or looking for a talent. Share your contact. Our students will be happy to connect with you. Come back at 1:30 after the lunch, and thank you so much. So far, so good. See you.